The morning after we buried my husband, my daughter-in-law changed the password on the household account. She thought I was still asleep. She thought grief had made me soft enough not to notice. She thought the woman sitting at the edge of a freshly made bed with red eyes and a black dress laid out for a second day was too broken to pay attention to the small, careful sounds a person makes when they are moving money they believe is already theirs. She was wrong about all of it. My name is Margaret Eloise Calloway. I am 72 years old. I was married to Gerald Calloway for 44 years. We built a life together from two people who had nothing, no inheritance, no family connections, no lucky breaks handed to us on silver platters. What we had was work. Gerald's kind and mine. The quiet, invisible, relentless kind that doesn't make headlines but builds a life so solid it takes decades for the people around you to start assuming it was always just there. I am not a dramatic woman. Gerald used to say that about me with a smile that could fill a room. Margaret could watch Rome burn and still remember to turn off the stove. I took that as a compliment. I still do. I spent 44 years being the woman who remembered everything and said very little. I know now that some people took that for weakness. You will understand, by the time this story is finished, exactly how wrong they were. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Linda's Life Diaries, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. Gerald died on a Tuesday in October, which felt wrong somehow. October is too beautiful a month for grief. The maples outside our bedroom window were turning every shade of copper and amber, and Gerald's hands, big, carpenter's hands that had built our back porch and every bookshelf in our house, were suddenly still. 44 years of those hands, and then Tuesday, and then nothing. He had been sick for 8 months. Long enough for the family to start making plans. I noticed that, too. Our son, Robert, flew in from Denver 3 days before the end. He brought his wife, Claudine, and their 2 teenage children, and he brought with him a particular kind of energy I had never seen in him before. Efficient. Organized in a way he had never been about anything in his adult life. He asked questions about Gerald's accounts on the second day. He asked them carefully, casually, the way you ask about the weather when you already know it's going to rain. Dad was always so good with the finances, Mom. Has anyone been looking at things? Making sure everything is in order? I told him his father had always handled things. I watched Robert nod slowly, satisfied. I watched him and Claudine exchange a look across the kitchen table that they believed I was too devastated to see. I had seen it. I cataloged it the way I catalog everything, quietly, completely, and without comment. Our daughter, Patricia, arrived the evening before the funeral with her husband, Dale, a man I have never especially trusted and who has never given me a specific reason I could name. Dale is the kind of man who shakes your hand and smiles and says all the right things and leaves you somehow feeling smaller after he is gone. Patricia inherited Gerald's warmth but married its opposite, and for 21 years I had been too polite to say so. Patricia cried beautifully at the funeral. I am not being cruel when I say that. She loved her father. But she also spent the car ride home asking Robert whether he thought now was the right time to discuss the estate or whether they should wait a few weeks for Mom's sake. I was sitting in the back seat between them. For my sake. I pressed my hands together in my lap and looked out the window at the October trees. Gerald, I thought, you would have laughed. What the children did not know, what no one knew, because Gerald and I had agreed together that no one needed to know, was that we were comfortable in a way that defied what our modest house and simple habits suggested. Gerald had worked 31 years as a master electrician and another 12 as a contractor with his own small firm. I had worked 28 years as an office manager for a regional insurance company and then another decade as a consultant after I left. We drove sensible cars. We shopped sales. We went to Hawaii once, for our 30th anniversary, and we talked about it for years afterward the way people talk about a miracle. We did not spend money we did not have. We did not impress people we did not respect. What we did, quietly and steadily, was save. And invest. And buy a second property when Robert was in college and Claudine was still just a girl his age that he occasionally mentioned in phone calls. And establish accounts that were structured in a particular way, for particular reasons, that Gerald's attorney, a careful man named Howard Fitch, had helped us arrange over the course of many years. Gerald had a will. Everyone knew about that will. Robert and Patricia had been named in it as far back as 15 years ago, and they both knew the general shape of what it contained. A portion of the house. A portion of the savings. A modest and dignified distribution. What they did not know was that there was a second will. A second will that superseded the first in almost every meaningful way. Gerald and I had discussed updating the original document for years. We had discussions about it the way married couples have discussions about everything, over coffee, over the sound of the evening news, over dinner on ordinary nights when the weight of the future settles in quietly beside you. And then, 14 months before Gerald got his diagnosis, we had the real conversation. The one where we stopped discussing and started deciding. I will tell you what changed. It was Claudine. Not in the way you might expect. Not one large dramatic moment, though those would come eventually. It was a series of small things, the kind that a woman who has spent decades paying close attention will collect the way other women collect sea glass, one piece at a time, turning each one over in the light to understand what she has found. Claudine had been married to my son for 16 years. In those 16 years she had come to our home for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the occasional summer visit, and in all of that time she had never once, not once, helped clear a table without being asked. She had never asked me how I was. She had never referred to me as anything other than Margaret, which is my name, and I have no objection to my name, but there is a difference between the way a person says your name when they see you and the way they say it when they are addressing the help. Claudine called me Margaret the second way. She also had opinions about our house that she shared with Robert within hearing distance of me, secure in her belief that I was either not listening or had ceased to matter enough to listen to. The kitchen was dated. The carpet in the master bedroom was such an odd choice. The way Gerald and I had arranged the back porch furniture was a little crowded, don't you think? I never responded to any of this. Gerald, who did hear some of it, would catch my eye across the room and press his lips together in a way that meant, I know. I see it. I'm sorry. And I would give the smallest shake of my head that meant, don't. It isn't worth it. But I was cataloging. Patricia's husband Dale had a different quality of unkindness. Where Claudine was cool and dismissive, Dale was actively calculating. He had borrowed money from Gerald twice in 15 years and repaid it once, incompletely. He referred to our home as the old place with an affection that wasn't quite affection. He asked about Gerald's business contacts with an interest that was dressed as curiosity but smelled like something else entirely. After Gerald's diagnosis, Dale started calling every few weeks to check in. This was new. Dale had never called to check in before. I would answer the phone and listen to 5 minutes of genuine-sounding concern and then feel, after we hung up, that something had just been subtly taken from me that I couldn't identify or name. I mentioned this to Gerald once. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, call Howard Fitch. Tell him we need to update the documents. Tell him to schedule something for next week. I did. We spent 4 hours in Howard Fitch's office on a Wednesday in August, 14 months before we would need any of it. Gerald was still strong then. He held my hand across the table and looked at Howard with the same expression he used when he was working out a complicated problem on a job site, calm, methodical, thorough. When we left, the second will existed. And we agreed, together, that it would stay quiet. People show you who they are when they think the money is already settled, Gerald said in the car on the way home. I know, I said. So let them show you, he said. And then we'll see. The days after the funeral arranged themselves around grief, which is what days do. Food arrived at the door from neighbors and church friends. Casseroles and glass dishes I would need to return. Flower arrangements I moved to the dining room table because the living room had begun to smell like a greenhouse. Cards with scripture verses and signatures from people I hadn't seen in years. Robert and Claudine stayed. Patricia and Dale stayed. All four of them in the house, filling the rooms with the sounds of people who believe they are helping. Claudine reorganized my kitchen on the third day. I came downstairs to find my spice cabinet rearranged and my good cast iron skillet moved to a different shelf. When I asked her why, she said brightly that the old arrangement hadn't been very functional and she had just wanted to make things easier for me. I said thank you. I moved the skillet back after she went to bed. Robert sat with me each morning and talked about his father in the gentle, careful way children talk about a parent they loved but never quite understood. I appreciated this about him. Whatever else I would come to feel about Robert in the weeks that followed, I believe his grief was real and I will not take that from him. It was on the 6th day that the questions started in earnest. I was sitting in Gerald's chair. I had taken to sitting in his chair in the evenings, not because I was morbid but because it smelled like him still and I was not ready to give that up, when Robert came and sat across from me. He was holding a cup of coffee. He looked like he had been preparing what he was about to say for several days, which he had. "Mom," he said, "we've been thinking about the practical side of things." "All right," I said. He explained, carefully and kindly, that he and Claudine were worried about me being in the house alone. It was a big house. The maintenance. The expenses. Patricia and Dale had the same concerns. They had been talking and they thought it might make sense for me to consider something more manageable. He mentioned a community in a neighboring town with a good reputation. Nice amenities. People my age. I looked at my son's face while he said all of this. I looked at the earnestness in it, and underneath the earnestness I looked for what I had been cataloging for 6 days, and there it was, the careful, practiced tone of someone who has already decided how the next chapter goes and is now in the process of reading it to you. "And the house?" I asked. He shifted slightly. "Well, that's something we'd all want to figure out together. As a family." "As a family." I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said. I did understand. I understood completely. What I did not say was that the house had been in my name alone since 2009, when we had refinanced and Gerald had suggested, with Howard Fitch's quiet agreement, that the deed be restructured in a way that made certain things clear. What I did not say was that the house, the investment accounts, the second property in the next county, and 12 other arrangements that Gerald and I had made together over the course of a careful and private lifetime were all contained in the second will, and that the second will would not be read until Howard Fitch called a meeting, and that Howard Fitch would not call a meeting until I told him to. I was not ready to tell him yet. I was still watching. Claudine made the household account comment to Robert in the hallway outside the master bedroom. She believed the door was fully closed. It was not fully closed. I have lived in this house for 31 years and I know the exact angle at which that door needs to be shut in order to actually shut. She said, "The passwords should probably all be changed over now anyway. We don't want anything getting complicated." He said, "I'll handle it." I lay in the dark on my side of the bed that was now entirely my side and I listened to this, and I breathed slowly and evenly, and I thought about Gerald in his chair across from Howard Fitch, holding my hand across the table, looking calm. I thought about what he said in the car afterward. "Let them show you." They were showing me. On the 9th day after the funeral, Dale took a phone call in the backyard that he believed was private. I was gardening. I am not invisible in my own backyard. Dale does not look at me carefully enough to notice where I am at any given moment because Dale has never found a reason to look at me carefully. I could not hear everything. I heard enough. Before the will reading. Shouldn't be complicated if it's set up the way. Her name on things, Dale, we need to. The call ended. Dale went back inside. I stood with my hands in the soil for a long moment and then I finished what I had been doing and came inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink. Claudine was at the counter making coffee. She gave me a small, concerned smile, the smile she had been giving me for 9 days, warm and practiced and just slightly too efficient. "How are you doing, Margaret?" "Fine," I said. "Thank you." She nodded and turned back to the coffee. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door fully, sat on the edge of the bed, and picked up my phone. I found the number I was looking for. It rang twice. "Howard," I said when he answered. "I think it's time." He understood exactly what I meant. "I'll call you tomorrow with dates," he said. "Thank you," I said. "One more thing, can we make sure both Robert and Patricia receive the formal notice?" "Both of them, and their spouses." There was a brief pause. Howard had known Gerald and me for a long time. He was not a man who expressed surprise easily, but he knew what it meant when I specified the spouses. "Of course," he said. I set the phone on the nightstand. Outside the window the October trees were still every impossible shade of gold and red. Gerald had loved October. He would put his coffee on the back porch railing and stand and just look at the trees sometimes, not saying anything. I used to stand beside him and look at the same trees and think about how much I loved a man who could be quiet with me. I sat in the bedroom for a while longer. Then I stood up, smoothed my slacks, and went downstairs to make dinner. I made enough for everyone. I set the table the way I always set the table. I said grace and I meant it. And across the table, my son and my daughter and their spouses ate the food I had made and talked around me the way people talk around something they have already decided to move, and I listened to every word, and I said almost nothing. They were not looking at me carefully enough to see that I was deciding something too. The letter from Howard Fitch's office arrived 10 days later, addressed to each of them individually, requesting their attendance at the formal reading of Gerald Calloway's estate documentation on a Friday morning at 11 o'clock. It was Robert who brought the letters in from the mailbox. I watched him from the kitchen window. I watched him look at the return address on his envelope, then look at the one addressed to Claudine, then look toward the house with an expression I recognized but could not quite name in that moment. He came inside. He set the letters on the kitchen counter without saying anything. I picked up mine, looked at it, and set it back down. "Howard called me," I said. "He has everything ready." Robert nodded. His voice was careful. "Mom, do you know what's in the will?" "Did Gerald ever?" "Gerald and I talked about everything," I said. That was true. "Right," Robert said. "Right." He picked up Claudine's letter and went to find her. I turned back to the window. The trees were still beautiful. 3 weeks out from when we had buried Gerald, and the light was still doing what October light does, which is make everything look like a painting of itself, a little too vivid, a little too final. I thought about Gerald's hands. I thought about Howard Fitch's office, and the table, and Gerald holding my hand across it while we signed the things that needed signing. I thought about Claudine rearranging my spice cabinet. About Dale on the phone in the garden. About Robert saying as a family with that practiced, careful tone. And I thought about what Gerald had said on the very last good day, when he could still sit up in the chair by the window and hold his coffee properly. "They're going to be surprised," I had said. He had smiled at me, that room-filling smile, and said, "That's the point, Margaret. That's entirely the point." Howard Fitch's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown that had been there since before I was born. The elevator was slow and the hallway carpet was a dark burgundy that had seen better decades, but the office itself was exactly what it had always been, quiet, wood-paneled, smelling of paper and the particular seriousness that accumulates in rooms where important things are decided. Gerald had always felt comfortable there. He said it was a room that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. I arrived 15 minutes early. I wore my good navy wool coat, the one Gerald had helped me pick out 6 years ago at a shop in the city that we had walked past a dozen times before finally going in. He said the color made my eyes look like they were thinking about something. I had worn it to his funeral and I wore it again that Friday morning, because I wanted to feel him beside me, and because I knew what the next 2 hours were going to require of me and I wanted to be dressed for it. Howard was already there. He shook my hand with both of his, which was not something Howard did often, and he looked at me the way old friends look at each other when no words are quite sufficient. We sat together for a few minutes in his inner office while his assistant arranged chairs in the conference room next door, and Howard went through the order of proceedings in a voice that was professionally calm and personally gentle. There were 2 documents. The original will, which the family had been anticipating, and the amendment, legally titled a codicil, though in practical terms it was comprehensive enough to be its own document, which superseded it in the areas that mattered most. Howard would present the original document first. Read the relevant sections. Allow questions. Then he would present the codicil. "Are you certain about the order?" he asked me. "Yes," I said. He nodded once, slowly. He understood why. I wanted them comfortable first. I wanted them to have exactly enough time to believe they knew what they were receiving. I wanted, if I am honest with myself, for them to have already begun planning, already begun distributing, in their minds, what they believed was coming to them, before the second document changed everything. Not out of cruelty. Gerald and I had talked about this at length. Out of clarity. Because the only way a person truly understands what they have lost is to have already held it in their imagination. We had discussed whether this was kind. We had concluded that it was honest, and that those two things were not always the same. They arrived together, which I had expected. Robert and Claudine first, then Patricia and Dale 2 minutes behind them. Robert had worn a jacket and tie, which he almost never did. Claudine was in a dark dress that managed to look both respectful and expensive. Patricia looked pale and had clearly not slept well. Dale was in the suit he wore to weddings and funerals, and he shook Howard's hand with the particular enthusiasm of a man who wants to establish himself as a serious participant in proceedings that do not belong to him. They arranged themselves in the conference room in a way that told me everything I needed to know about the preceding 2 weeks. Robert and Claudine sat on one side of the long table. Patricia and Dale sat on the other. They had, I realized, been caucusing. Coming to this meeting not as individual family members but as 2 units with individual calculations, individual hopes, individual plans for what they intended to do with their portions of what they believed Gerald had left behind. I sat at the head of the table. Howard sat to my right. There was a brief moment, I saw it cross Claudine's face first, then Robert's, when they registered that I had chosen the head of the table. That it had not occurred to them that this was my place to take. That they had, without quite articulating it to themselves, already begun imagining me somewhere else. I unfolded my hands on the table and looked at my children and said good morning. They said good morning back. Howard opened the first document. I will not reproduce every word of it. What I will tell you is that the original will was generous, and deliberately so. Gerald had loved his children. He had been proud of Robert's career and Patricia's family and the ways they had grown into themselves over decades that he had watched carefully and with great affection. The original document reflected that love in real and tangible numbers. I watched Robert's face as Howard read. I watched the careful neutrality he was maintaining, the practiced stillness of someone who has been told something in advance and is working not to show it. Because of course Robert had looked into this. Of course he had done what people do when they believe an inheritance is coming, he had made calls, asked careful questions, formed expectations. The original will confirmed most of what he expected. When Howard finished reading the primary document and set it down, there was a silence. Patricia let out a slow breath. Dale adjusted his cuffs. Claudine's hands, folded on the table, relaxed by a degree I might not have noticed if I hadn't been watching. Are there any questions about the primary document before we proceed? Howard asked. There were clarifying questions. Normal ones. Howard answered them. Robert asked one about the timeline for distribution. Howard answered that too. Then Howard said, there is a second document I need to present. A codicil to the primary will, executed 14 months ago and legally registered at that time. The codicil supersedes the primary will in several significant areas. I'll read it in full. The room changed. Not loudly. The room didn't change with anyone raising their voice or making a dramatic sound. It changed in the way rooms change when oxygen is quietly removed, a subtle pressure shift, a collective stillness, a quality of attention that was different from what had been there a moment before. Robert looked at me. It was the first time since we sat down that he had looked at me directly. I looked back at him, and I did not look away, and I did not explain anything, because there was nothing to explain yet. Howard would explain it. That was why Howard was there. Howard read the codicil in the same measured voice he used for everything, which is one of the reasons I have trusted him for decades. He does not editorialize. He does not pause for effect. He reads what is written and allows the words to do what words do. The codicil established several things. The first was the structure of what Gerald and I had built together over 4 decades of marriage, not the modest picture the family had been working from, but the full accounting. The investment accounts Gerald had managed quietly and well. The second property in Harlan County that we had purchased 31 years ago and held onto through every economic season since, whose current value was something none of them had known to ask about. The business assets from Gerald's contracting firm that had been restructured years ago in a way that was not reflected in any document the children had ever seen. Numbers I will not state here because they belong to me and not to this story, but numbers that caused a particular quality of silence in that conference room that I have not experienced before or since. The second thing the codicil established was primary control. Gerald had left me everything. Not equally divided. Not partially distributed. Everything, all of it, managed and dispersed at my sole discretion, for the remainder of my life, at which point a separate trust structure would govern what passed to the next generation and how and under what conditions. Howard had helped us draft those conditions carefully. They were specific. They were not punitive. They were the conditions of people who had thought hard about what they actually wanted to leave behind and what they wanted those they loved to do with it. The third thing, and this was the part that Howard reached last, reading it in the same unvarying tone, which somehow made it land harder than any dramatic emphasis could have, concerned the house. The house had never been part of the marital estate in the way the family believed. It had been in my name alone since 2009. The codicil confirmed this and clarified it and established what that meant going forward, which was that any conversations about what might become of the house, what might be more manageable for me, what the family might want to figure out together, those conversations had been, from the beginning, conversations about something that was not theirs to figure out. Howard set the codicil down. He folded his hands on top of it. He said, "I'm happy to answer any questions." The first sound in the room after Howard stopped speaking was Dale. Not a word. A sound. The particular sound a man makes when he has been calculating something for weeks and the calculation has just been erased. It was short and involuntary and he caught it quickly, but not before everyone at the table heard it, and not before I saw Patricia look at him with an expression that I understood to be the beginning of a much longer conversation they would have later, privately, about everything they had said to each other over the preceding weeks about what they had expected this morning to confirm. Robert was very still. Claudine was looking at the table. Patricia said, quietly, "Mom." Just that. Just my name. But she said it the way people say a name when they are recalibrating, when the person they believed they understood has revealed a dimension they failed to account for, and the name itself has to be spoken aloud to re-establish what is real. "Yes," I said. When she stopped. Started again. "Dad knew about all of this?" "Your father and I made every decision together," I said. "We always did." She nodded slowly. Her eyes were filling. I do not believe it was grief in the transactional sense. I believe Patricia, of my 2 children, had a more genuine and complicated reaction in that room than the others did. She had loved her father. She had also, in the weeks since we buried him, allowed herself to be guided by Dale into a set of expectations and a set of conversations that she might not have had on her own. She was reckoning with more than one thing at once, and I recognized that, and I felt for her even as I sat still and let the reckoning happen. Robert spoke without looking up. "The house has been in your name since 2009. "That's correct." "And the Harlan County property?" "Since 1993. A silence. "And the investment accounts?" "Structured in my name, with Gerald as secondary." "Yes." Robert was quiet for a long moment. I watched something move across his face that I had not seen there since he was a child and had been caught in something he couldn't talk his way out of, not anger exactly, and not sorrow exactly, But the particular expression of a person who has just understood that the story they were telling themselves was not the story that was actually being told. "We've been talking," he said finally, carefully, "about what would be best for you moving forward." "I know," I said. "We were trying to help." "I know that too," I said. And I meant it, to the degree it was true. I meant the part of it that was true. "But you didn't tell us," he said, and now his voice had something else in it, something that wanted to be grievance but could not quite find its footing, about any of this. "You let us, all of this time, you let us." "I let you show me who you were," I said, very quietly. "Your father asked me to. And I did." The room was so still I could hear the heat through the vents. Howard sat beside me like a man who has been in many rooms at many moments of this kind and knows his role in this particular one is to be a witness and nothing more. Claudine said, addressing Howard rather than me, "What does this mean practically? In terms of the timeline for?" "Everything is at Mrs. Calloway's discretion," Howard said. "The codicil is clear. There is no mandated timeline. There are no automatic distributions outside of the trust provisions, which activate only upon Mrs. Calloway's death." Claudine looked at me then. It was the first time in 16 years that Claudine had looked at me with something other than the polite, proprietary, slightly pitying attention she usually extended in my direction. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Which, I suppose, she was. I looked back at her steadily. "I think," Dale said, with a heartiness that sounded like a man trying to restart an engine that isn't catching, "that we all just need some time to process this. It's a lot to take in. We're all still grieving, Anne." "Dale," I said. He stopped. "I'd like a moment with my children," I said. "Just the two of them." There was a pause. Dale looked at Patricia. Claudine looked at Robert. The specific dynamic of a moment where spouses are asked to leave a room played out in compressed silence across the conference table. Howard said pleasantly that he would step out as well and give us some privacy, and he gathered his documents and led Claudine and Dale into the hallway with the practiced ease of a man who has managed difficult rooms for 40 years. The door closed. The three of us, Robert, Patricia, and I, were alone. For a moment nobody said anything. The quiet in the room was different from the quiet before. Less pressurized. More honest. Patricia was the one who spoke first. "Why didn't you tell us, Mom?" I thought about how to answer this. I had thought about it before, in the weeks of watching and cataloging and sitting in Gerald's chair in the evenings and feeling the shape of what I was deciding. "Because your father asked me not to," I said. "And because he was right." "About what?" "About what people show you when they think the money is already settled." Patricia looked down at her hands. Robert was very still. "That's not fair," Robert said. "That implies." "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," I said. "Either of you. I want you to hear that clearly. What happened in the last 3 weeks happened. I'm not interested in turning it into a trial." I paused. "But I am also not going to pretend it didn't happen. You talked about moving me out of my own house. You talked about what would be practical. You talked about figuring things out as a family about things that were never the family's to figure out. I sat at my own dinner table and listened to plans being made around me as though I were a piece of furniture being considered for reupholstering." Robert's jaw tightened. "We were worried about you." "Some of it was that," I said. "I believe some of it was that. I also believe some of it was something else, and I think you know what I mean, and I think you know that I know, and I don't think there's anything to be gained by spelling it out further." Silence. "Your father," I said, more gently, "loved you both very much. This is not a punishment. Nothing about today is a punishment. The way the estate is structured is the way your father and I decided to structure it because it reflects what we built together and what we believe is right. You will be provided for. Your children will be provided for. Those provisions are real and they are in the documents Howard has. But they are on our terms. On the terms Gerald and I decided, together, after 44 years of deciding things together. Not the terms that anyone else decided we should have. Patricia looked up. Her eyes were wet. Did you know? Before he died, did you know we were? Yes, I said simply. She closed her eyes. A tear went down her cheek, and it was not a performance. I recognized the difference. I'm sorry, she said. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I thought about all the years of her, the baby, the child, the difficult teenager, the young woman, the mother she had become. I thought about the ways grief makes people smaller than themselves and the ways people around grief sometimes take advantage of that smallness without quite knowing that's what they're doing. I know you are, I said. I believe you. Robert had not said he was sorry. He was sitting with his hands on the table, looking at a point somewhere between his hands and the far wall, working through something privately. I did not push him. Robert has always needed more time than Patricia to arrive at things. Gerald was the same way. It was one of the reasons they had never quite known how to talk to each other and one of the reasons they had been more alike than either of them ever acknowledged. What happens now? He asked finally. Now I go home, I said. And you go home. And Howard will be in touch about the formal distribution timeline. And we continue being a family, which means whatever we decide it means, going forward. And Claudine, he started. What Claudine and Dale heard today in this room is their business, I said. What you choose to do with it is yours. He nodded once. He still hadn't looked at me directly since Howard had finished reading the codicil. I was patient with this. Gerald had taught me, over 4 decades, the particular patience required for letting a proud person find their way back to you without losing the thing that makes them themselves. Howard knocked gently and opened the door. Whenever you're ready, he said. I stood and straightened my navy coat and picked up my bag. I looked at my son and my daughter, my children, Gerald's children, the 2 people we had spent our lives raising and protecting and loving and now, in this room, on this ordinary Friday morning in November, telling the truth to. I'll call you both this weekend, I said. Then I walked out. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Linda's Life Diaries. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. The drive home took 22 minutes. I know because I counted them. Not anxiously, I was not anxious. I counted them the way you count things when you want to stay inside your own body, when something large has happened and you need the ordinary world to confirm it is still there. Traffic lights. The sound of the radio, which I left on a station playing something I didn't recognize. The familiar sequence of turns that led back to my street, my driveway, my house with its burgundy front door that Gerald had painted himself 3 years ago and refused help with. I sat in the car for a moment after I turned off the engine. The house looked the same as it always looked. There was nothing about it from the outside that announced what it was, what it contained, what it had witnessed, what it would continue to be. It was simply a house on a street in November with a burgundy door and a maple tree in the front yard that had finally finished dropping its leaves. I went inside. I put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen window while the water heated, looking out at the backyard where Dale had taken his phone call and where Gerald had stood so many mornings with his coffee looking at the trees. The garden was finished for the season, put to bed the way I always put it to bed, mulched and covered and ready to be something again in spring. The kettle whistled. I made tea and I carried it to the living room and I sat in Gerald's chair, and for the first time since he died I sat in it not to feel him but to feel myself. To feel the shape of who I was now that the morning in Howard Fitch's office had happened and could not be unhappened. 72 years old. A widow. A mother. The sole holder of something that had been built over a lifetime of work and partnership and deliberate, patient, undemonstrative care. The keeper of a second will that had waited in Howard's filing system for 14 months like a letter that was always going to be sent and had simply been waiting for the right moment. I thought about Claudine's face when Howard said at Mrs. Calloway's discretion. I thought about Dale's sound. That small, involuntary sound. I thought about Robert still staring at the table. Patricia crying genuinely. The hallway carpet that had seen better decades. Howard's careful voice reading words that Gerald and I had sat across a table and chosen together on an ordinary Wednesday in August. I picked up my phone. There was a voicemail from a number I recognized, Doris, my neighbor to the left, a woman I had known for 27 years who had brought a green bean casserole 3 days after Gerald died and stayed for 2 hours and talked about everything except Gerald, which was exactly what I had needed. Doris has that gift. I called her back. How did it go? She asked, because Doris knew there was a meeting today, though not the specifics. It went the way it was supposed to go, I said. And how are you? I looked around the living room, at the bookshelves Gerald had built, at the photographs on the wall, at the particular slant of November light through the windows that I had been looking at for 31 years. I'm all right, I said. And I meant it completely. Robert called the next morning. I had half expected Claudine to call first, or to call instead, but it was Robert. He called at 8:15, which is when he has always called when something is serious. 8:15 means he has been awake for a while. 8:15 means he thought through what he was going to say before he dialed. Mom. Good morning, Robert. A pause. I owe you an apology. I waited. He stopped. Started again. Claudine and I were talking about the house. Before yesterday. About what it might be worth and what made sense and another stop. I told myself it was about taking care of you. Mostly I think I believed that. But I also think I wanted to believe it because it made what we were doing feel okay. This was more than I had expected from Robert in this timeline. More than I had expected this soon. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I should have just asked you, he said. What you needed. What you wanted. Instead of talking around you like I was already somewhere else, I said quietly. Yes. A long breath. Like that. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the garden and sat there briefly, the red of it startling against all the gray-brown of November, and then it was gone. Your father was the one who wanted the second will, I said. I want you to know that. I want you to know it was his idea as much as mine. He said that people show you who they are when they think things are already settled. He wanted to know who you were. He loved you. He wanted to know you. Robert didn't say anything for a moment. And what did he see? He asked finally. What did you see? People under pressure, I said. Which is not the same as bad people. I want to be careful about that. You were scared. Grief makes people act from fear in ways they wouldn't otherwise. I've watched that happen and I've extended it the grace it deserves. I paused. But I have also seen what I've seen. And so has your father. And we made the decisions we made with open eyes. Are you? He hesitated. Is there room for things to be different? Going forward? I thought about this. I thought about Gerald. I thought about 44 years of doing things together and choosing carefully and not spending energy on performances. There's always room for things to be different, I said. If they actually become different. That's what room is for. He said he understood. I believe he did, at least partially. Partially is where most things start. Patricia came to the house on Sunday. She came alone, without Dale, which meant something. She brought tulips from the grocery store in the particular orange that has always been my favorite color, and she had not been told my favorite color recently, she simply remembered it, which is a different thing from being strategic, and I recognized the difference. We sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't talk about the will or the house or the meeting in Howard's office. We talked about her children and about a book she was reading and about the tulips and about a specific memory of Gerald at a birthday party 20 years ago that made us both laugh until we were wiping our eyes. At the end, when she stood to go, she hugged me for a long time. Not the hurried, efficient hug of the preceding weeks. The real kind. I want to be better, she said quietly. I don't want to be the kind of daughter that you have to protect yourself from. I held on to her for a moment. Then be better, I said. That's all it takes. Just actually be it. She nodded against my shoulder. Tell Dale, I said, when we had separated, that the Harlan County property is not going to be anyone's concern but mine. If he has further questions about the estate, he can contact Howard. Patricia blinked. Okay. I just want that to be clear, I said. So we don't have to have that conversation. She nodded once, and I saw in her face that she understood more than she had said, that she knew something about what Dale had been doing and thinking that she would now have to reckon within the privacy of her own marriage. That reckoning was not mine to manage. It was hers. She left. I stood in the doorway and watched her car go down the street. Then I went back inside and finished my coffee. The weeks that followed were quieter. Not empty, my life has never been empty, and at 72 I have accumulated enough interests and friendships and small daily habits to fill every hour of a day without difficulty. But the particular noise of the preceding month, the phone calls, the casseroles, the careful questions, the voices making plans around me, that noise subsided. In its place came something I hadn't realized I had been missing until I had it back, the sound of my own home at rest. I had coffee with Doris on Tuesdays. I went to my garden club on Thursdays, where a woman named Ruth had been my friend for 19 years and asked no questions about anything and made me laugh more reliably than almost anyone I have ever known. I called Howard twice with small clarifying questions about the trust structure and once to tell him he had done his job beautifully, which I believe in paying people when they deserve it. I did not hear from Dale. This was expected and correct. I did not hear from Claudine for 3 weeks, and then one evening she called. Her voice was different from the voice she had always used with me. It had no particular warmth in it, which surprised me less than you might think. Claudine's warmth had never been reliable, and a version of her without it was in some ways more honest. She said she wanted to understand, going forward, how Robert's family fit into she paused, the picture, given the structure of the estate. The same way you've always fit in, I said. You're my son's family. That doesn't change. But the financial. Howard will be in touch about the specific provisions for Robert's branch of the trust. Everything is in the documents. I paused. Claudine, I want to say something to you directly. She waited. I am not your adversary, I said. I was never your adversary. I was simply someone you underestimated, and the consequences of that are what they are. We can go forward from here in a way that works, or we can spend energy on something that won't change anything. I would prefer the former. There was a silence. All right, she said. Good, I said. I'll see you at Thanksgiving. She said yes. We hung up. I don't know what Claudine will do with all of this over time. People are complicated and grief is complicated, and the place where complicated people intersect with grief produces results that are not always predictable. What I know is that I said what I meant to say, and I set the terms clearly, and what happens after that is hers to decide. On a Thursday 6 weeks after the will reading, I drove out to Harlan County. It was the first time I had been to the property since Gerald had gotten sick. We used to go out together a few times a year, just to look at it, 41 acres of land that butted up against a ridge, with a small cabin on it that Gerald had spent years quietly improving, adding the porch himself, fixing the windows, putting in a wood stove that heated the whole space beautifully in November. It was where we went when we needed to be somewhere no one could find us. Where we sat on the porch in the evenings and listened to nothing in particular and felt lucky. I parked at the end of the gravel drive and sat for a moment looking at the cabin. The ridge behind it was still holding a few last leaves, stubborn ones, the kind that cling past their time. The rest of the hillside was bare and brown and honest, the way things are in November when they have stopped pretending. I got out and walked up to the porch and stood there for a while. The air was cold and clean and smelled like pine and wood smoke from somewhere, though there was no smoke I could see. I thought about Gerald standing here. I thought about the way he looked at things he loved, with that quiet, complete attention, not rushing toward what he was seeing but simply meeting it. I thought about the meeting in Howard's room and the codicil and Robert's 8:15 phone call and Patricia's tulips, orange on my kitchen table, and Claudine's voice stripped of its practiced warmth, and Dale who had not called and would not call, and everything that had been shown to me in the weeks since I buried my husband. I thought about what it means to have spent 44 years building something with someone and then to be the one left standing in it. It is not nothing. That is what I want to say to you, whoever is listening to this story and recognizing something in it. It is not nothing, what we build. What we hold. What we choose, quietly and deliberately, over decades that the world around us does not always see or honor or understand. The women who stretch dollars and keep houses and raise children and fold themselves into the shapes that families need them to be, we are not furniture. We are not fixtures. We are not the quiet backdrop against which other people's stories happen. We are the ones who remember where every penny lives. We are the ones Gerald trusted to wait and watch and decide. We are the ones who already know what we are going to do. We are simply waiting for the right moment. I stood on the porch of the cabin for a long time. Then I went inside and opened the wood stove and built a fire, the way Gerald had taught me, and I sat beside it in the chair closest to the window and watched the last stubborn leaves on the ridge. Spring came the way spring always comes after a hard winter, not announcing itself but simply appearing one morning in the form of something small and irrefutable. A crocus at the edge of the garden bed. The particular quality of light through the kitchen window at 7 in the morning changed overnight from gray to something that remembered gold. The sound of birds I hadn't heard since October, back now and conducting their business in the maple tree with the cheerful indifference of creatures who do not concern themselves with what happened while they were gone. I planted tulips that first week of March. Orange ones, the way Patricia had brought them, and also white and deep purple, because Gerald had loved purple tulips and I had never planted them before and I could not tell you now exactly why, except that sometimes we save things for a time we don't yet know we're saving them for. My knees ached when I knelt in the garden bed. They always ache now. I have made my peace with this. I was still on my knees pressing bulbs into the earth when my phone rang in the pocket of my gardening jacket. The number on the screen was one I recognized but had not seen in several months, Dale. I looked at it for a moment. Then I set it face down in the grass beside me and finished the row I was working on. He left a voicemail. I listened to it that evening, standing at the kitchen sink with a glass of water, in the same spot where I had watched him in the backyard on the 9th day after Gerald's funeral, speaking in the half-heard fragments that had told me everything I needed to know. The voicemail lasted 4 minutes. Dale's voice was the voice of a man working hard to sound casual about something that was not casual. He mentioned Patricia. He mentioned the children. He mentioned that he and Patricia had been having some conversations about the future, their future, the family's future, and that he had some thoughts, if I had time sometime, about some opportunities in Harlan County that might be worth exploring together. Opportunities in Harlan County. I deleted the voicemail. I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, and I could tell from the quality of her hello that she had been expecting this call, which meant she knew about Dale's voicemail, which meant things in that household were operating in ways that Patricia had either authorized or was aware of and had not stopped. I waited. Patricia said, "Mom, I know why you're calling." "Tell me what you know," I said. A pause. He's had some ideas. About the land. He found out about an agricultural development project in that county and he thought, she stopped. I told him not to call you. I told him it wasn't his place. But he called anyway. Yes. I was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the garden bed where I had just pressed the tulip bulbs into the dark soil. "Patricia," I said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly." "All right. Do you want me to have a relationship with Dale?" The question sat in the silence between us. I heard her breathe. "He's my husband, Mom." "I know he is." "That's not what I asked." Another silence, longer this time. "I think," she said finally, slowly, "that Dale is someone who is very focused on things that ultimately don't matter as much as he thinks they do. And I think I've allowed that for a long time because it was easier than addressing it." She stopped. "I don't think he's a bad person." I think he's a person who hasn't been asked to be better often enough. By you, I said. By me, she agreed. Then that is a conversation for your marriage, I said. What I will tell you is that Dale will not be contacting me about Harlan County or anything else. If he does, I'll let Howard know, and Howard will communicate with him directly, and it will become a legal matter rather than a family one. I want to be clear about that so that you can be clear with Dale. Patricia said nothing for a moment. He's not going to like that, she said. I'm not asking him to like it, I said. I'm telling you what is. Okay, she said. Her voice was quiet and had something in it that I recognized from when she was a child sitting at the kitchen table after being corrected, not resentment but the particular dignity of someone absorbing a truth that costs something. Okay, Mom. Now, I said, tell me about the children. Tell me something good. And she did, and we talked for another 40 minutes about her youngest school play and her oldest basketball and a trip they were considering in the summer, and by the time we hung up I believed, cautiously, the way I believe most things now, that Patricia was in the slow process of becoming something more honest than she had been. Whether Dale would participate in that process was Dale's business. I went to bed that night and slept well. Dale did not call again. I don't know what Patricia said to him. I don't know the shape of the conversation they had or what it cost them or what it changed. That is their life and not mine to know. What I know is that the silence from Dale's number continued, and that when Patricia brought her children to visit me the following month she came without him, and she did not offer an explanation and I did not ask for one. We made cookies with my grandchildren and watched a film and ate dinner at my table, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that my dining room contained only people who wanted to be in it. That is not a small thing. Robert and I found our way back to each other more slowly, the way Robert finds his way to most things, methodically, without announcement, through the accumulation of small consistent gestures rather than a single dramatic one. He called on Sundays. He called at 8:15 when it was something real and at other hours when it was simply his son calling his mother, which I treasured more than he probably knew. He asked me questions about myself that he had not asked before, what I was reading, what I was doing with the garden, whether I had been out to Harlan County, whether I was sleeping well. I answered honestly. Claudine remained Claudine. This is not criticism. She was polite with me in a way that was new, a politeness built on accurate information rather than comfortable assumption, and I respected it for what it was. We were not going to be close. We had never been close. The difference now was that we both understood why, and neither of us was pretending otherwise, and in its own way that was a kind of progress. She did not rearrange my kitchen again. In April, Howard Fitch called to check in. He did this every few months, as he had always done, and the conversations were practical and warm and efficient in the way that conversations with Howard always were. We went through several administrative matters. I asked a question about one of the investment accounts and he answered it. He asked whether I had any concerns about the trust provisions and I told him they were exactly right. Then he said, there is one other thing. A property inquiry. I waited. Someone has been making inquiries with the county assessor's office about the Harlan County land. Assessed value, development potential, that sort of thing. It's public record. I only know because the assessor's office flagged it as part of the monitoring service we set up when we registered the deed transfer. I don't know who made the inquiries. I had a thought about who had made the inquiries. I kept it to myself. What would you like to do? Howard asked. Nothing yet, I said. But I'd like you to send a standard notice to the county assessor confirming my ownership status and my intention to maintain the property in its current use indefinitely. And copy Dale Merritt on it. Howard was quiet for a moment. Patricia's husband. Yes. I see, Howard said, in the voice he uses when he understands something completely but is too professional to say so. Thank you, Howard. Of course. 3 days later Patricia called me. She said, Dale received a letter from your attorney. I know. Mom. Patricia, I said, not unkindly but without any softness in it either, I told you what would happen. I meant it. A long silence. Is this, she stopped. Is this going to affect us? You and me? Not if you and I are separate from what Dale does, I said. And that is a choice you have to make. The silence stretched out, and in it I heard my daughter deciding something. I could not see her face, but I knew her face and I understood what was happening in it, the particular expression of a woman who has let someone else's priorities become her own for long enough that the boundary between them has grown unclear, and who is now, slowly and with some pain, beginning to locate it again. Okay, she said. I'll talk to him. Good, I said. I'll see you next month. After we hung up I sat for a moment with my hands in my lap, in Gerald's chair, in the room where the afternoon light came through the west window at this particular angle in April that it never came through in any other month. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. I was not angry with Patricia or with Dale or with Robert or with Claudine, not any longer, not in a way that cost me anything. What I had held, through the autumn and the winter and into this early spring, was not anger. It was clarity. And clarity, unlike anger, does not exhaust the person carrying it. Gerald had been right about that. The grandchildren came to stay with me for a week in June. All of them, Robert's 2 boys and Patricia's 3, ranging in age from 9 to 15, arrived on a Saturday morning with their overnight bags and their opinions and their enormous appetites and the specific chaos that 5 children generate when placed in a house that has been quiet for months. They filled every room. They left shoes in the hallway. They had arguments about which film to watch that lasted longer than any film would have. They found the checkers set in the closet and played 17 consecutive games and argued about every one. I fed them smothered chicken and corn pudding and the good biscuits, the ones Gerald had always requested for special occasions, and I watched them eat with the particular satisfaction of a woman who knows what she made and chose to make it. On the 3rd evening, when the younger ones were asleep and the older 3 of 15, 14, and 13, were still awake, they sat with me on the back porch in the warm evening. My oldest grandson, Robert's son Marcus, who is 15 and has Gerald's eyes and a seriousness about him that I find enormously promising, asked me something I did not expect. Grandma, he said, did Grandpa really plan everything? Like, before he died? I looked at him. Where did you hear that? Dad said something. Not a lot. Just that you and Grandpa that things were arranged. The other 2 were listening, though trying to look as though they weren't. Patricia's daughter Lily, 14, who has her mother's face and her grandmother's habit of noticing everything. Robert's younger son, Thomas, 13, who was looking at the backyard very carefully in the way he looks at things when he is paying close attention. I considered what to say. Your grandfather and I made plans together, I said. For a long time. Because we believed that taking care of each other meant thinking ahead, not just feeling. Was it because of us? Marcus asked. What happened after? He paused. I heard my parents fighting. Before Thanksgiving. About you. I looked at him steadily. Adults make mistakes when they're scared, I said. Your father loves me. He made some mistakes from being scared. That's different from being a bad person. But you knew, Marcus said. Not an accusation. An observation. You knew and you waited. Yes. Why? I thought about Gerald in his chair by the window on the last good day. I thought about Howard's office and the burgundy hallway carpet and the sound Dale made when the numbers landed. I thought about October and November and the winter and the tulip bulbs in the dark soil. Because sometimes, I said, the most important thing you can do is let people show you who they are before you decide what to do next. Not to punish them. Just to see clearly. Your grandfather taught me that. Marcus thought about this for a long moment. That sounds hard, he said. It is, I said. It's one of the hardest things there is. Watching and waiting and staying quiet when your instinct is to defend yourself or explain yourself or fix everything immediately. But your grandfather also taught me that patience and passivity are not the same thing. You can be very still on the outside and very busy on the inside. Lily said, softly, is that what you were? Busy on the inside? The whole time, I said. She smiled at that. A small smile that had something knowing in it, some early version of a quality I recognized because I had it too and because I understood what it was like to carry that quality in a world that did not always know what to do with it. "I'm going to be like that," she said. Not a question. "I think you already are," I said. We sat on the porch for another hour, the four of us, in the warm dark, and talked about easier things. About Gerald. About his hands and his patience and his room-filling smile. About the cabin in Harlan County and the wood stove and the way the ridge looked in November. About the things he built with his own hands in this house and the things he taught us all, by example, about what it meant to build a life with care. Thomas fell asleep in his chair before the hour was out, which was such a Gerald thing to do. Gerald could fall asleep anywhere, comfortably, without warning, as though sleep were simply another thing he was good at, that I laughed when I noticed, and Marcus and Lily laughed too, and the three of us sat in the warm laughing quiet while Thomas slept and the fireflies did what fireflies do in June in a backyard that has been tended for 31 years. It was one of the best evenings I can remember. In August I drove out to Harlan County with Doris. I had told her, by then, more of the story than I had told most people. Doris is the kind of friend who receives information without doing anything melodramatic with it, which is rarer than it should be. She had listened to the parts one chose to tell her over coffee on various Tuesdays, and she had said what she said, which was, "Good for you, Margaret." Gerald always knew what he had. We drove out on a Tuesday morning because Doris had cleared her calendar and I had always wanted to show her the property and because I had decided, quietly and after considerable thought, what I was going to do with the cabin. I was going to make it mine in a way it had always been but that I had never fully claimed. We walked the perimeter of the 41 acres, slowly, because Doris's hip is not what it was and my knees are not what they were. We walked along the ridge where in November the last stubborn leaves had clung, which in August was dense and green and alive with the sounds of things I could not name. We sat on the porch of the cabin in the two chairs Gerald had placed there, both of them his choices, both of them worn and solid and permanent feeling in the way of things chosen for durability rather than appearance. I told Doris about a plan I had been forming. The cabin needed work. Not structural work, Gerald had kept it sound, but the kind of work that makes a space fully habitable and fully itself. A proper kitchen. Better insulation. The bedroom expanded to include a reading room, because I intended to spend considerable time here and I require a reading room the way other people require a good view. A garden, though the soil would need work. A path down to the creek at the edge of the property that Gerald had always meant to clear and never quite got to. I was going to hire people to do the parts one couldn't do. I was going to do the parts one could. I was going to spend, I estimated, 3 or 4 months of each year here, spring and fall, the beautiful seasons, the seasons that reward patience. Doris listened to all of this. "And you'll be here alone?" she asked. "Sometimes," I said. "And sometimes Ruth and I will come out. And I'll have the grandchildren when they want to come." "Marcus has already asked." "Marcus is a good boy," Doris said. "He has his grandfather's eyes," I said. We sat for a while without talking, in the 2 worn chairs on the porch, with the ridge green above us and the creek audible somewhere below, and the absolute specific silence of a piece of land that has been held and cared for and loved for 31 years. "Gerald picked this place, didn't he?" Doris said. It was not quite a question. "We both did," I said. "But yes. He found it first. He had good instincts." "About most things," I said. She looked at me sideways, with the particular expression of a woman who has known you long enough to read what you mean when you say most things and is kind enough not to press on the exception. "Are you happy, Margaret?" she asked. I thought about this honestly, the way I try to think about things that matter. "I am something better than happy," I said. "I am settled. I know where I am. I know what I have and what I've decided and what I'm not going to spend any more of myself on. That feels like more than happy. It feels like something that will hold." Doris nodded slowly. "That's what Henry was, at the end." "Settled?" Henry was Doris's husband, gone 11 years now. I used to think settled sounded boring. Now I think it sounds like the point. "It is the point," I said. The renovations at the cabin began in September. A contractor named Earl, who had worked with Gerald years ago and who addressed me as Mrs. Calloway with a genuine deference that had nothing performative in it, the deference of someone who respected Gerald and extended that respect to me as a matter of course. Earl had a crew of 4 and they worked efficiently and asked me questions when they needed to and left me alone when they didn't, which is exactly the right approach. I drove out twice a week while the work was being done. I brought coffee and sometimes lunch and I walked the property and I watched the cabin become more fully itself and I felt, in those hours, a satisfaction that I could not have described to anyone who had not spent a life building something slowly and carefully and with their whole attention. On the second visit in October, exactly 1 year after Gerald died, though I had not planned it that way, or perhaps I had without knowing it, I stood on the newly finished porch in the afternoon light and looked at the ridge. The maples were turning again. Every shade of copper and amber, the same as the maples outside my bedroom window, had been on the morning Gerald's hands when still. The same colors. The same light. The same October doing what October does, which is make everything look like a painting of itself, a little too vivid, a little too final. I stood there for a long time. I thought about 44 years. I thought about a man who built things with his hands and thought carefully about the future and held my hand across a table in a lawyer's office on a Wednesday in August because he wanted to make sure I would be all right after he was gone. I thought about what all right had come to mean, across the months since then, not the diminished, managed, arranged version of all right that the family had been moving toward in those first weeks, but this version, standing on a porch I own outright in the middle of 41 acres of land that no one can touch, in a navy coat, looking at October. I thought about Marcus asking me, was it because of us? And I thought, no. It was because of me. It was because Gerald knew me and trusted me and left me everything, not because he wanted to reward me or punish anyone else, but because he believed, after 44 years of watching me catalog and quiet and notice and wait, that I would know what to do with it. And I did. At Christmas, both families came to the house. I want to be precise about this, I invited them. I chose the date and I set the terms and I made the food I wanted to make and arranged the rooms the way I wanted to arrange them and sat at the head of my own table in my own home that has been mine, in every sense of the word, for 31 years. Robert and Claudine. Patricia and Dale. Dale shook my hand when he arrived with a handshake that was ordinary and appropriately sized, not the large, establishing handshake of the previous year, not anything pointed or performed. Just a handshake. I accepted it. I offered him coffee. He thanked me and took it, and that was, for the remainder of the evening, the total of our interaction, which suited both of us precisely. Claudine helped carry dishes from the kitchen to the dining room. She did this without being asked and without commentary and with a quiet efficiency that I respected. She is a capable woman. She has always been a capable woman. The question was never capability. The grandchildren filled the house with noise again, which is what grandchildren are for. We ate and we talked and we laughed, not at everything, not without the particular texture that grief gives to the first holidays after a loss. Gerald was present in the room the way absent people are present, in the habits and stories and the specific chair that no one sat in. But we were also alive, and eating, and together, and the living part was not nothing. After dinner, when the grandchildren had migrated to the living room and the adults were still at the table with their coffee, Robert said, "Mom, I want to say something." The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when someone announces they have something to say. "I spent a long time this year being angry," he said. He was looking at the table, then he looked up at me. "Not at you. Or, some of it at you. But mostly at myself. For how I handled things. For what I allowed myself to think and to do." He paused. "I want you to know that I know. That I know what I did and I know it was wrong. Not just the practical things. The way I thought about you. The way Claudine and I talked about you." Claudine was looking at her coffee cup. "I thought about Dad a lot this year," Robert continued. "About what he would say. And what I kept coming back to was, he would have been ashamed of me. In those first weeks. He would have been deeply ashamed, and he wouldn't have said so, because that was Dad, but I would have known." He stopped. I don't want to be someone my father would be ashamed of. The room was very still. He wouldn't tell you that, I said. Gerald didn't deal in shame. He dealt in, do better. He would look at you the way he looked at everyone he loved when they had made a mistake, which was, I see you. Now do better. Robert looked at me. He saw you, I said. That's what the second will was about. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a punishment. He wanted to see you. Both of you. I looked at Patricia too. He loved you too much to leave without knowing. Patricia had tears on her face again, and this time I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. He knew, I said. He also knew that people are more than the worst version of themselves under pressure. He believed that. I believe it too. Do you believe it about us? Robert asked. I looked at my son. At the 43-year-old man who had his father's height and my eyes and a capacity for both calculation and genuine love that would spend the rest of his life in tension with each other, working itself out in ways he could not yet predict. I'm watching, I said. He almost smiled. Almost. That's a yes, he said. It's a maybe, I said. Which is better than a no, and you have time to earn the rest. In February I signed the final papers on the cabin renovation. Earl handed them to me across the kitchen counter, the new kitchen counter, butcher block, Gerald would have approved, and I signed my name in full, Margaret Eloise Calloway. The same name on the deed. The same name Howard had in his files. The same name that had been on the second will, waiting, for 14 months. I handed the papers back to Earl. He shook my hand. It's a beautiful place, Mrs. Calloway, he said. Gerald always had good taste. We both did, I said. He smiled at that, a genuine smile, and said, goodbye, and I heard his truck back down the gravel drive and then there was only quiet. I stood in the new kitchen and looked out the new window at the February hillside, bare and clean and waiting for spring the way bare February hillsides do. Patient. Completely unhurried. I put on the kettle. While the water heated, I thought about everything that had led me to this kitchen, in this cabin, in this county, on this particular February morning. The tablet Gerald left on the kitchen table. No, farther back than that. The long conversations over coffee and over the news. Howard Fitch's office. Gerald's hand in mine across the table. The drive home, and what he said, and what I promised. I thought about 9 days after a funeral and a hallway door that was not quite closed. I thought about sitting in the car at the airport with my phone and watching the money move. No, that was Evelyn Parker, the woman from the story I sometimes think of when I think about women who waited and watched. I think of her as a kind of sister, though she doesn't know me. I think of Evelyn Washington and her cedar chest and her skillet and her sticky note and the word leftovers. I think of all the women who sat in quiet rooms and knew things and waited and then, when the moment arrived, moved precisely. We are everywhere. We have always been everywhere. The kettle whistled. I made tea and carried it to the porch, and I sat in Gerald's chair, my chair now, both of them mine, and I looked at the February ridge and I felt, as clearly as I have ever felt anything, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because everything was resolved. It isn't, entirely, families are not resolved, they are ongoing, and the work of being a family is the work of continuing, imperfectly, together. Robert will make me proud and disappoint me, probably in the same month. Patricia is becoming someone better than she was, slowly, in the way that real change actually happens. Dale is Dale. Claudine is learning the shape of a new kind of respect. Marcus is 15 and already more serious than the world knows what to do with him, which means he will be extraordinary. And I am here. 72 years old. A widow. A mother. A woman who owns 41 acres of land and a cabin with a wood stove and a new reading room and a path down to the creek that Earl's crew cleared for me, finally, the thing Gerald had always meant to do. I am not waiting for anything. I am not afraid of anything. I am Margaret Eloise Calloway, and I know where every penny lives, and I know what I built, and I know what it is worth, and I know, with the specific, settled, unhurried knowledge of a woman who has watched and waited and decided that I am exactly the right person to decide what happens next. Gerald knew it too. That was the whole point. That was entirely the point. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.